Hey folks, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. Well, I have to say, I'm kind of looking out of the window here and it's still snowing like crazy. It snowed all night and it's scheduled to stop in an hour or so. So this afternoon I'll be on the tractor moving it. For those of you who don't live in a place where it's snowy for 5 or 6 months of the year, let me tell you, that romanticism, that Christmassy feel, that gets old really, really quickly. And even though I've got a tractor moving snow, it gets tiring. Maybe it's just me that's tired and old, I don't know. But anyways, you didn't tune in to listen to me moaning. Well, I thought I would talk today about another of the great fighters of yesteryear. Possibly the greatest ever, a matter for conjecture. And that's going to be Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis, of course, has the honor of being the longest reigning heavyweight champion ever. And he also had 25 title defenses in that 11-year span when he was heavyweight champion of the world. I'm not seeing that that's a feat likely to be replicated ever. Certainly not in eras where the belt is split. At this time, of course, it was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. But there's a lot of ground to cover before we get to Joe Louis assuming the heavyweight crown. So let's dig into that a little bit. As always, I strongly encourage people to go onto YouTube or other streaming services and see the number of very, very good documentary films that have been uploaded by really first-class content creators. And when you're watching those films, you might sometimes wonder at the British broadcasters sometimes referring to Joe Louis. Well, not to worry. It's one and the same fighter. It's just that back in the 30s and 40s, some of the broadcast people chose to pronounce Joe Louis's last name in the French pronunciation, Louis. But like I say, not to worry, we're talking about the same fellow. Now, Joe Louis was born in 1914 in Alabama. He was christened Joseph Louis Barrow, and he was the son of people who were sharecroppers. And what's really interesting is that both of his parents were themselves children of former slaves. That's when you spend a moment thinking about that, that's quite something, isn't it? Really, it's both your maternal and paternal grandparents had been slaves at some point in their lives. Wow, different world, eh? Anyhow, Mr. Barrow, unfortunately, was committed to an asylum, and his mom and the kids moved to Detroit. His mom subsequently remarried. They're very poor people, as you will notice with all these great champions of the past. Virtually none of them come from what we would consider to be middle class or upper class backgrounds. They were all, products of very, very impoverished circumstances. Now, Joe Louis took up amateur boxing and he became a very successful amateur boxer. He won regional Golden Gloves titles, and he ended up having 54 fights as an amateur, and he won 50 of them. 43 of those 50 he won by knockout. In 1934, he turns professional and he teams up with Chappie Blackburn as a trainer. Interestingly, this is one of the best relationships you will come across between fighter and trainer. They certainly worked as a duo. What's also interesting is that at first, Blackburn was a little reluctant to take Joe Louis on as a fighter because Joe Louis said he wanted to be heavyweight champion of the world. And this was a time when there was a bar on black athletes fighting for the world heavyweight title. America had experienced its first black champion in Jack Johnson, and America had decided, or certainly, shall we say, white America, had decided that they didn't want to see any more African Americans become world champion. But Joe Louis, he had that as a dream. And Chubby Blackburn worked with him to make that dream come true. Now, the first 20 fights that Joe Louis had, he won them all. And if you look at BoxRec, you'll see that a number of the people he fought against had good records. So I want to dispel from the get-go any suggestion that Joe Louis was fighting cab drivers and tomato cans, as the common North American expressions for people who are no good. And that wasn't true at all. Sure, he fought some journeymen along the way, and some of the people he ended up fighting through his career were not the greatest, but you fight who's put in front of you. We'll talk about that a little later. On his 20th fight, Joe Louis is matched against the former world heavyweight champion Primo Carnera. Now today, people look at Primo Carnera's career with skepticism because, of course, we now know that he was associated, through no fault of his own, to mobsters who used him and abused him, actually. And so there's question marks about Primo Carnera's legitimacy as a heavyweight champion. Those arguments were not being made in 1935, and he was still a behemoth of a human being. 6'7", walking around weight about 280 or so quite often. Anyhow, he enters the ring against Joe Louis, who was weighing 198. Primo Carnera was weighing 260. So there's 62-pound weight differential between the two. So we talk about Fury Usyk as being the giant and the small guy. Well, this is another one of those examples. Well, Joe Louis was having none of Primo Carnera's size, and he dropped him several times in the fight. And the fight was eventually stopped in the 6th round. Primo Carnera's, I think the journalist at the time said he was helpless on the top rope. And you can find this fight online, and you can see that Joe Louis was certainly levels above Primo Carnera and chopped the big man down. Carnera was no coward, though. I don't think there was anybody in those days who was lily-livered at all. Certainly was getting up and trying his absolute best. But Joe Louis was too much for him. There was just a qualitative difference in fighters rather. In the same year, Joe Louis fought and beat Max Baer, and stopping Max Baer in the 4th round with a knockout. Max Baer, of course, was another very, very well-respected former champ. Now, you would think, okay, it's what now, 20, 22, 23, 4 fights in, has to be given a shot at the world heavyweight title. Well, no. Like I was saying earlier on, the powers that be were certainly not keen on Joe Louis getting anywhere close to the world heavyweight title. There was newspaper articles which you can find online that speak about the dangers of allowing an African-American fighter to challenge for the world heavyweight title. And some of those articles but they're all racist. Some of them are quite overt. So go and have a read. And yeah, that was America less than 100 years ago, eh? So Joe Louis continues on his career until he gets an opportunity to fight Max Schmeling. And that fight, I'm just looking at my notes, took place in June the 19th, 1936. Now, Max Schmeling was a German, of course. And Max Schmeling was not just a German, but he was a German at the time that Nazi Germany was in its ascendancy. Max Schmeling sailed over to the United States, and unusual for those days, he'd had an opportunity to observe film of Joe Louis. And he said that he saw something in Joe Louis's style that he could take advantage of. And what he'd seen was when Joe Louis jabbed, he brought his hand back a little lower than he probably should have. And this, of course, gave Schmeling an opportunity to land a big right. which he did. He dropped Joe Louis a few times before Joe Louis was unable to beat the count. And it was a 12th round knockout of Joe Louis. So this really brought Joe Louis, who was, at that time, a white-hot prospect who was champing at the bit for an opportunity to fight for the world title. It brought his career to a bit of a shuddering close. But interestingly, this is just my thinking, that it might have been the best thing that could have happened to Joe Louis. Because I wonder, if he'd beaten Max Schmeling, would he have been given a shot at the title? Well, you'd like to say yes, but bearing in mind what we've been talking about, the color bar, I'm not sure if it would have happened. But he lost to Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling now becomes the #1 contender in the world, and that puts the powers that be in a bit of a dilemma. Do you let somebody who's, even though Max Schmeling was not a Nazi, never joined the Nazi party, and he should not be associated with Nazism, he was still perceived as being the representative of Nazi Germany. Do you let that fellow fight for the World Heavyweight Championship, or do you let Joe Louis, a black American, fight for the World Heavyweight Championship? And you can just imagine conversations that were probably occurred in cigar smoke-filled rooms back in those days. Sort of lesser of two evils in the eyes of some people, I'm sure. The big fear was that if Schmeling was given a title shot, Schmeling would win, and then the title goes off to Nazi Germany, and it's probably never going to be fought for again by an American. So the powers that be, even though Joe Louis had lost to Max Schmeling, they decided to give Joe Louis a shot at the title. And of course the title at that time was held by James Braddock. And in order to allow Joe Louis to fight Braddock, Joe Louis had to agree to forfeit 10% of all future earnings to Braddock. So he had to pay against future earnings for the privilege of fighting for the World Heavyweight title. I'm not making this up. This is true. It's mind-boggling, but it's the way things were then. Anyhow, he gets his opportunity to fight against Jim Braddock. Now, this wasn't an immediate sort of, he's lost against Schmeling and now he gets to fight Braddock. He fought a number of times, including beating Jack Sharkey, who was a very well-known heavyweight at the time, and a number of other, well-known fighters. But he gets into the ring in 1937 against Braddock, and he beats Braddock by way of knockout in the 8th round of the scheduled 15-round title championship. And this is an amazing moment, not just for Black America, but for everybody really. And Joe Louis became a household word, and it is said that when African American kids would complain to their mom and dad about that, whatever was too hard to do, those parents would say, "Look, Joe Louis can do it, you can do it." So he's just tremendously inspirational. But Joe Louis, even though he'd beaten Braddock, he still felt that he didn't really want to call himself champion until he erased the loss against Max Schmeling. And you compare that to a modern fighter who gets gifted a belt and then has the audacity to step into the ring with somebody who'd given it to him, who'd stopped him previously, and sort of, saying inappropriate things. No names being mentioned, but people could take a leaf out of Joe Louis's book in the sportsmanship category, that's for sure. That's me just editorializing. It's my channel. Anyhow, he gets a rematch with Max Schmeling. And now this was the massive fight. Joe Louis It's world heavyweight champion. Not just a symbol at this point of Black America, but the symbol of America, of the West, of freedom, democracy, apple pie, motherhood, all those good things, against the challenger, Max Schmeling, who was thought of as being the symbol of repressive, fascistic Nazi Germany. Easily the biggest fight of the first half of the 20th century, and in the eyes of many, the biggest fight of the century. If you're my age or younger, you'll automatically think of Ali Fraser. If you were older than me, you would have thought of Joe Louis and Schmeling. Objectively, I think it was Joe Louis and Schmeling. There was so much pressure on Joe Louis. Absolutely, like, unbelievable pressure. The President of the United States telling him, you've got to win for the country. The weight of a nation on your shoulders, and you're facing a man who had previously beaten you. I don't know. To me, that sounds immense. But Joe Louis didn't let the pressure get to him. He wins that fight in a first-round knockout, erasing the loss against Max Schmeling and affirming that he is the greatest. He is the world heavyweight champion. And by extension, America is greater than Nazi Germany. That's like how big it was. It's almost impossible to overstate the magnitude of that fight. Well, Joe Louis, of course, doesn't sit back on his laurels. He doesn't retire or anything like that. He continues on with his career. He beats a number of well-known fighters in the day, including the two-ton Tony Galento, the amusingly named Johnny Paycheck, Abe Simon, Buddy Bear, Abe Simon a second time, Billy Conn, who of course was a light heavyweight champion. At least I think he was a champion. May or may not be. Somebody can correct me in the comments if I've got this wrong. In fact, he had two fights with Billy Conn. The first he almost lost before Joe Louis knocked him out in the 13th round. And of course the rematch was after the war. And he beat Billy Conn by an 8th round KO. Now, Joe Louis, he joins up. Of course, America's at war, World War II. He joins up. And he has, during World War II, over 90 fights as exhibition fights for the troops. And he gets, he hands over his winnings, in many cases, to the Army and Navy, Army or Navy Relief Fund. He pays out of his own pocket for funeral expenses for service people. It's thought that he exposed something like 5 million servicemen to being able to see Joe Louis. Remember, this is a time before television, right? So, Joe Louis does an exhibition in front of thousands and thousands and thousands of troops. Like, wow, they get to see Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world. And like I say, he's giving his paychecks away, giving his prize money away, not claiming that I'm going to give it to charity and then not doing so, but really and truly giving away his money. And we're not talking of nickels and dimes. One of his paychecks was $70,000. Now, $70,000 in the 1940s, I haven't done the math, but it's a substantial amount of money. Well, of course, the expression no good deed goes unpunished. Gosh, never was that so apt, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, after the war, Joe Louis has two very famous fights with Jersey Joe Walcott. And we met Jersey Joe Walcott in a previous video in this series, and Jersey Joe Walcott was beaten by Rocky Marciano. The first fight in 1947 was somewhat controversial. Joe Louis was given a split decision. And the second fight in 1948, Joe Louis decided he wasn't going to allow this to go to the scorecards, and he knocks out Walcott in the 11th round. Now, at that time, Joe Louis had amassed 25 championship defenses, and he retired in 1949. That should have been all she wrote. Joe Louis was clearly a national treasure. He had broken all sorts of racial barriers. He was arguably the first black American to become a national sports hero. And he always portrayed himself as the clean-cut, humble, if you like, the antithesis of what Jack Johnson had been a quarter century early on. However, you remember he gave away his paychecks during World War II? In an act that is just shameful, the United States Internal Revenue Service went after him for the tax on those earnings. Now, it's thought that what happened is that Joe Louis gets a check made out to Joe Louis. He signs the back of the check and he gives it to the Army or the Navy or whatever. But of course, that's income in his hands, and the IRS went after him. Could an exception have been made? Of course. Absolutely. Should an exception have been made? Of course. Absolutely. The President of the United States, by some sort of executive order, could have made it all go away. But no. They hounded him and went after him, and they forced him to, so he's forced to come back. He comes back in 1950. He loses to Ezra Charles. And then he goes on and has another 9 fights before sadly ending his career in 1951 against Rocky Marciano. I'm just going to check that date. Yeah. October the 26th, 1951, Rocky Marciano knocks him out through the bottom rope. And the way his career ended, as we said in a previous video, informed Rocky Marciano that, hey, when I get, within a year or two of retirement, I don't want to go out that way. Well, Joe Louis, of course, it would be nice to say that he was at least able to live the rest of his life in luxury. But that's not true. The IRS, even though he'd had these comeback fights, he still wasn't able to get out really from under the hammer of the IRS, who were apparently charging him like $50,000 a year interest on what was owed to him. And he did everything he could to pay it back. He ended up working in Caesar's Palace as a greeter, and living and working in Caesar's Palace as a greeter. And he passed away in 1981, and I think he was 67 years of age, passed away of heart failure. So a very, very sad ending for a great champion. It's absolutely shameful the way his own government treated him. When he passed away, he was, of course, recognized. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery because, of course, his service during World War II. And his funeral was attended by the good and the great of the day, including Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, and other luminaries. But it's still a sad and upsetting way for a great champion to have lived his final years. Now, where do we rate Joe Louis? Is he overrated? Is he underrated? Is he rated just about right? I've seen people on YouTube. I've heard people talk about Joe Louis as a plodder, slow, fought against the tomato can things. I say to those people, you're full of shit. Joe Louis was a great fighter. He fought the very best that was put in front of him, and in while he's, of course, because he retired before I was born, he's not relevant to my lifetime top 10. He's absolutely in my all-time top 10. The question for me is where? And maybe in a video down the road, we'll address that. But Joe Louis, salute him. A great champion. Go and watch videos of him. Go read about him. An awesome human being, a great boxer, and just a great human being, a great champion. Clearly, I'm a Joe Louis fan. If you've liked this video, please like it. Please comment. I like the comments, the back and forth. That's really, really good for me. And wherever you are, have a fabulous day. I will try and enjoy myself moving snow. But whatever you do, you gotta be happy. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.